One morning, as I walked my son to school, I noticed how he kept tugging at his hoodie, desperately trying to hide the thin scars that marked his face. They weren't fresh, they weren't dangerous, but they were there, permanent reminders of a long-forgotten accident that shaped his childhood. I could see the way he lowered his gaze when other children ran past, whispering and giggling as if his very presence was some cruel joke. It broke me in ways I can't explain, because he wasn't just my child. He was my world, and those scars were a part of him that I cherished, even if the world didn't. What I didn't know then was that the cruelty of kids would soon pale in comparison to the moment when the bully's own mother laid eyes on my son, and everything she thought, she knew came crashing down. I always knew kids could be cruel, but I wasn't prepared for the day my son came home with his backpack dragging behind him, his shirt torn at the shoulder and his eyes red from holding back tears. He didn't even want to talk at first. He just sat at the kitchen table staring at his plate of untouched dinner, the fork trembling in his hand. Finally, the words slipped out in a broken whisper. "They called me Frankenstein, Mom. They said I should wear a mask so no one has to see me." I froze. I wanted to tell him they were just words, that they didn't matter. But the truth is, they did matter. Because those words were chiseling away at his confidence, at his sense of belonging, at the fragile hope he carried that one day people would look past his scars and see the beautiful, kind soul that I saw every single morning when he smiled at me. He told me the bully's name. It was Liam, a boy in his class, bigger than most, always surrounded by a group of kids who laughed at everything he said. And behind Liam's cruelty, I could sense the echo of something else, something he must have learned at home. Kids don't invent that kind of malice all on their own. I remember going to the school, sitting across from the teacher with my hands clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. I explained what happened, showed her the bruises on my son's arm, repeated the exact words they had used. She nodded, sympathetic, but her eyes flickered with that tired look I knew too well. "We'll talk to the parents. We'll monitor the situation," she promised. But there was no urgency, no fire, just paperwork and policies. That night, when I tucked my son into bed, he asked me in the softest voice, "Mom, will I always look like this?" My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. I told him no matter what he looked like, he was perfect. But deep down, I hated myself for not being able to erase the scars, for not shielding him from the ugliness of the world. Weeks passed and the bullying didn't stop. If anything, it grew worse. My son stopped raising his hand in class, stopped asking to play outside, even stopped looking in the mirror. The sparkle in his eyes dimmed, replaced by a heaviness I recognized too well, the weight of shame. I felt powerless, until the day everything changed. It was during a school fundraiser, one of those forced social events where parents gathered in the gymnasium decorated with paper stars and folding tables covered in cheap snacks. I almost didn't go, but my son begged me to. He wanted to prove to himself he could show up, that he wouldn't let them break him completely. I watched him from across the room as he walked slowly toward the table, holding a plastic cup of juice, his hoodie pulled up over his head. That's when I noticed Liam, standing just a few feet away with his friends, smirking and whispering. I braced myself for what would come next. But then something unexpected happened. A woman walked in, tall, polished, with sharp eyes that seemed to scan the room like she owned it. She went straight to Liam, put her hand on his shoulder, and whispered something to him. He stiffened immediately. That was his mother, and in that moment my son turned slightly, the hood falling back just enough to reveal the scars on his cheek. Her eyes landed on him, and I swear her entire face drained of color. She didn't look disgusted. She looked haunted, pale, shaken, as though those scars pulled up a memory she had spent years burying. I couldn't understand it at first, but her reaction told me one thing with absolute certainty. There was a story behind those scars, one that connected to her more deeply than I ever could have imagined. And from that moment, I knew the balance of power had shifted. What she saw in my son's face was not just a reminder of pain. It was a mirror she couldn't turn away from. And soon, she would have no choice but to confront the truth that was about to unravel everything. I could not stop replaying that moment in my mind, the way her perfectly composed expression crumbled in front of me. Parents talk. They brag, they gossip, they defend their kids even when they're wrong. But this woman's reaction wasn't defensive at all. It was raw, startled recognition, like she had just seen a ghost. For the rest of the fundraiser, she kept glancing at my son, her face pale and lips pressed tightly together. Liam, who was usually loud and cocky, stayed unusually quiet at her side. Something was off and I could feel it in the pit of my stomach. That night, I asked my son again to tell me exactly what had been happening with Liam, every detail, every word. He told me about the taunts, the shoves in the hallway, the times they hid his backpack and poured milk into his shoes. My fists clenched at the thought, but then he added something that made me pause. Liam said his mom told him scars like mine mean people are broken. He said his mom says people like me shouldn't even be in normal schools. I froze. My anger shifted instantly from the boy to the woman who was supposed to be raising him. It all made sense. Cruelty that polish didn't start in the classroom, it started at home. But if she truly believed what she said, then why did she look at my son with such horror when she saw his face? The contradiction gnawed at me. The following week, fate handed me an answer. I was dropping off my son at school when I overheard two other mothers whispering by the entrance. I usually ignored that kind of chatter, but one sentence stopped me in my tracks. Did you know Liam's mom had a brother who... Their voices lowered. I stepped closer, pretending to check my phone. He was in a car accident when they were kids. Bad one. They say he never recovered. She never talks about it. My breath caught. A car accident. A brother. Scars. Suddenly, the pieces fit together. Her reaction at the fundraiser, the haunted look in her eyes. She wasn't just seeing my son. She was seeing her past. A brother disfigured, maybe bullied, maybe worse. And now here was my child, carrying on his face the very reminder she had spent her life trying to erase. I should have felt sympathy, but all I felt was fury. Because instead of teaching her son compassion, instead of telling him to protect kids who looked different, she had filled him with poison. She turned her own trauma into a weapon and aimed it at my boy. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, writing everything down. Every incident, every cruel word, every bruise. I collected screenshots of texts where classmates mocked him, some repeating words Liam had obviously started. I kept every teacher email that brushed me off, every promise that went nowhere. I was building a record, not just for the school, but for myself. Because I had realized something important. No one was going to save my son but me. Days later, the school called me in for a meeting. Liam's mother would be there, my son's teacher, the principal. I almost laughed when I saw the agenda, a polite discussion about classroom behavior. But I didn't walk into that room empty-handed. I had my folder of evidence pressed under my arm like armor. The meeting started predictably, the principal thanking us for coming, the teacher explaining there had been some misunderstandings. Liam's mother sat across from me, immaculate as ever, her lipstick perfect, her eyes avoiding mine. But the second my son lifted his head and the light caught the scars on his cheek, she shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She saw him. She remembered. I waited until the teacher finished her carefully vague explanation, and then I laid it all out on the table, literally. I slid photographs of my son's bruised arms across the desk. I opened the folder and pulled out screenshots of cruel messages, each one naming Liam. I read aloud the exact words my son had whispered to me, repeating them slowly so they would sting. Frankenstein. Wear a mask, broken. My voice never cracked. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just spoke steady and deliberate. The silence that followed was heavy. The principal cleared his throat and mumbled something about taking this very seriously, but my eyes stayed locked on hers. And that's when I saw it. Not just guilt, not just shame, but fear. Fear that her secret had been exposed in a way she couldn't control. She finally spoke, her voice tighter than before. "I'm sorry your son has gone through this." It wasn't much, but it was the first admission of responsibility I had heard. The meeting ended with promises of stricter monitoring, anti-bullying workshops, all the usual bureaucratic words. But I knew this wasn't over. Because when we walked out, I caught Liam's mother watching my son again, her face pale, lips pressed thin. And this time, it wasn't just recognition. It was a reckoning she couldn't escape. And in that moment, I made a quiet decision. If she wasn't going to change for herself, then I would make sure she changed for her son, because mine deserved peace. And I was ready to do whatever it took to give it to him. The days after that meeting were eerily quiet, almost too quiet. My son came home without new bruises, his things still in his backpack where they belonged, but the tension in his shoulders told me he was just waiting for the next strike. Liam still watched him in the hallways, and the smirk hadn't vanished completely. It had only grown cautious, like a predator who sensed the trap but hadn't quite lost the hunger. And then there was his mother. I started noticing her at drop-off and pickup more often, though she usually sent Liam with a sitter. Now she was there, standing stiffly near the gates, her sunglasses covering half her face, her jaw tight. Twice our eyes met, and both times she looked away quickly, but not before I saw the flicker of something between defiance and dread. I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe I was reading too much into a woman trying to keep up appearances. But then came the moment that proved otherwise. One Friday afternoon, as parents were gathering outside for pickup, she walked straight toward me. My stomach tightened. I braced for confrontation. Instead, she stopped just close enough to speak quietly. "Your son's scars. How did he get them?" Her voice trembled, though her face was carefully composed. I hesitated. It wasn't a question I usually answered casually. It was my son's story, not something I offered up to satisfy curiosity. But there was something raw in her tone, a desperation I hadn't heard before. So I told her simply, "A fire when he was little, an accident we were lucky to survive." I didn't give details. I didn't need to. Her eyes darted away, and she whispered almost to herself, "My brother." Then she stopped, swallowed, and quickly gathered herself. "Forget it," she said sharply, and turned on her heel before I could press her further. But it was too late. I knew I had been right. Those scars weren't just reminders for my son. They were for her, too. She was carrying ghosts, and instead of facing them, she had turned them into lessons of cruelty for her own child. That night, I sat in the dim light of the kitchen, my son asleep upstairs, and I wrote it all down in my journal. Not just the bullying, but the way she had looked at him, the way she had slipped up. I felt the weight of a story I didn't fully know yet, but one I was determined to uncover. Because understanding her fear might be the key to ending my son's torment for good. The next week, the school counselor scheduled a session for Liam and my son together. I wasn't sure it was a good idea, but I allowed it. Maybe they thought peer mediation would smooth things over. When I picked my son up that day, he looked shaken but stronger somehow. He told me Liam had been quiet, barely speaking. And when he did, his voice cracked. "My mom said people with scars are broken," Liam muttered. "But then she cried last night. She said she was wrong. She said her brother was the best person she ever knew." My son didn't know what to say to that, so he just sat there in silence. But those words echoed in my mind long after. Later, I did some quiet digging. A few old neighbors I tracked down through community groups online, a few whispers from older parents who had lived here longer. The story was consistent. Liam's uncle, her younger brother, had been in a car crash when he was a teenager. The accident had left him scarred and struggling. He dropped out of school after relentless bullying, withdrew from friends, and eventually disappeared from town entirely. Some said he passed away. Others said he simply left and never came back. Either way, the pain followed her, and she had turned it into armor. Instead of protecting children like her brother, she built a wall of cruelty around her son so he'd be the one wielding power, not suffering under it. I should have pitied her. But I didn't. Because whatever scars she carried, They didn't give her the right to let my child bleed emotionally day after day. I made a decision then. I wouldn't just wait for her conscience to wake up. I would hold her accountable. I started keeping a meticulous record, not just for the school, but for the district, for the board, for any authority that would listen. Every slight, every glance, every cruel word filtered through Liam's mouth that originated in hers. I would be the voice for my son until he found his own again. And slowly, I could see it working. My son began walking taller, as if he sensed I was building a shield around him that no insult could pierce. And for the first time in months, I felt the tide turning. She had seen herself in his scars, and whether she admitted it or not, it rattled her to the core. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something much larger. Because soon, the truth she tried to bury would surface, and when it did, there would be no hiding from it. Not for her. Not for her son. And certainly not for the community that had watched in silence until now. It was around this point that I realized silence was my greatest enemy. For too long, I had kept the bullying confined to closed doors. Meetings with teachers, whispered conversations at home, journal entries no one else saw. But bullies thrive in silence, and parents who enable them rely on shame to keep their victims quiet. So I began to speak. At first, it was small. I confided in a few other mothers I trusted, women who had also complained about Liam's behavior but had been brushed aside. They leaned in as I spoke, nodding, their faces tight with recognition. One even whispered, "My daughter said he pushed her down the stairs last year." They called it an accident. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about my son. This was a pattern, a cycle she had allowed to continue because it gave her boy a shield of dominance, just like she wished her brother had once had. I compiled everything, testimonies from other kids, messages parents forwarded me, all of it printed, dated, and stored in a thick binder. My kitchen counter became a war room, papers spread everywhere, highlighter marks tracing patterns of abuse. I wasn't frantic. I wasn't losing control. I was calm, steady, deliberate. Because I knew if I was going to dismantle this, I needed to do it carefully, brick by brick. Then came the night that pushed me from preparation into action. My son came home with his hoodie zipped up, but I noticed the stiffness in his movements. When I gently coaxed him, he unzipped it to reveal fresh scratches across his chest. My hands trembled as I traced the marks, not deep, but deliberate. They had cornered him again, tried to rip open his shirt to prove the scars went further down his body. He begged me not to tell anyone. "Mom, they'll just make it worse. They'll say I'm weak." My throat tightened, but I promised him softly, "You're not weak, and this ends now." The next morning, I walked into the principal's office with my binder under my arm. He began with the usual placating tone, trying to soothe the situation with promises of disciplinary action. But I didn't hand him complaints. I handed him evidence, photographs, names, statements. Then I slid across the table a letter I had already drafted to the superintendent and the school board, copied to the district's legal counsel. His face changed instantly. For the first time, I saw urgency. For the first time, I saw fear that his inaction could cost him his job. But the most striking moment came later that afternoon when I passed Liam's mother in the parking lot. She stopped me, and her voice was not sharp this time. It was strained, almost pleading. "You don't understand. My brother, he couldn't handle it. They destroyed him, and I swore my son would never be the one destroyed. Better they fear him than hurt him." Her words spilled out like poison she couldn't hold back anymore. I stared at her, stunned, then asked quietly, "And what about mine? What about the child you're letting him destroy?" For a split second, I saw her falter like she didn't have an answer. But then her face hardened, the mask returning, and she walked away without another word. That night, I held my son a little tighter, but inside I felt something shifting. She had admitted it. She had revealed her twisted logic, the way she had weaponized her brother's tragedy into cruelty. And now she knew I wasn't just a passive parent. I was documenting, I was pushing, I was building momentum. Every glance she gave me at pickup, Every stiff posture at school events told me she understood the walls were closing in. I also noticed a change in Liam. He wasn't so bold anymore. The ringleader facade was cracking. He avoided my son more often than not, his swagger gone. I overheard one boy mutter, "Don't mess with him, his mom will go to the board." Word was spreading. The power dynamic was shifting, and for the first time, my son walked down those halls without shrinking. He still carried the scars on his skin, but I could see the slow return of something brighter. The belief that he deserved space in this world, that he wasn't defined by what they said. Still, I knew this was only the beginning. Because a woman like her doesn't just back down. She fights, she manipulates, she hides, and soon she would try to protect the facade she had built. But she underestimated one thing. I was done being silent. And the louder I became, the less power she had left to cling to. The turning point came sooner than I expected. A week later, the school announced there would be a parent forum on bullying and student safety. A move clearly meant to quiet growing complaints. I almost laughed when I read the flyer. I knew it was their attempt at damage control. But I also knew it was my chance. I showed up early, binder in hand, my son sitting beside me with his hood down for the first time in public. The gymnasium buzzed with chatter, rows of folding chairs lined up under the fluorescent lights. Parents shuffled in, some with polite smiles, others with the weary faces of people who had long given up expecting real change. And then she walked in. Liam's mother, immaculate as always, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She scanned the room like she owned it, but when her gaze landed on me and my son, I saw the flicker again, the pale stiffness in her expression that betrayed what was hiding underneath. The principal began with a speech about community and zero tolerance, words so hollow they echoed in the silence. Then came the open floor. Parents were invited to share experiences, ask questions. At first, no one spoke. People shifted uncomfortably, not wanting to be the first. That's when I stood. My voice was calm but firm as I recounted what my son had endured. The taunts, the bruises, the way he had stopped looking in the mirror. I didn't use vague phrases. I used dates, times, direct quotes. I opened my binder and read aloud from messages other parents had given me, stories of their own children pushed, mocked, excluded. And then I said the words that made the entire room shift. These aren't isolated incidents. This is a pattern, and it's being taught at home. Gasps rippled through the crowd. My son looked up at me with wide eyes, his small hand gripping mine under the table. Across the room, Liam's mother stiffened, her face pale as stone. I saw the calculation in her eyes, the desperate need to maintain control. She stood suddenly, her voice sharp and ringing. "This is slander. You have no right to drag my family into this. Children fight. That's all this is out of children being children." But the room didn't rally to her. Instead, whispers spread like wildfire, parents turning to each other, sharing looks of recognition. One mother stood up from the back and said, "My daughter came home crying because of Liam, too." Another added, "My son stopped coming to recess because of him." The floodgates opened. For the first time, the silence broke. The principal fumbled, trying to regain control, but it was too late. The truth had spilled into the open, and no amount of polished denial could put it back. I looked at her then, across that room full of eyes, and I realized she wasn't just pale, she was terrified. Because the very thing she had tried to bury, the shame of her brother's scars, was now reflected in the voices of dozens of parents who wouldn't stay quiet anymore. After the meeting, she cornered me in the parking lot. Her voice shook, but it wasn't anger this time. It was something closer to desperation. "You don't understand what it's like to watch someone you love crumble because of scars. My brother never made it. He took his own life, and I swore my son would never be the victim, so I taught him to fight first." Her words hung in the night air, heavy and raw. For a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I looked at my son, standing quietly beside me, still carrying the bruises from her choices. My voice was steady when I answered, "You turned your fear into cruelty. You made my child pay for your brother's pain." "That stops now," she didn't reply. She just stood there, shaking, before finally walking away. And that was when I knew she was unraveling. Because for the first time, she had admitted the truth. Not just to me, but to herself. And once the truth is out, it can't be hidden again. That night, as I tucked my son into bed, he whispered, "Mom, you were so brave." But I shook my head and kissed his forehead. "No, sweetheart, you were. You showed up every day, even when they tried to break you. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen." He smiled then, a small, fragile smile, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I saw hope flicker back into his eyes. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Because people like her don't let go easily. They push back, they claw, they scramble to protect the image they've built. And I was ready for it. Because I had the truth, and I had my son. And together, we were stronger than the secrets she had tried to bury for decades. The backlash came exactly as I expected. Within days of that parent forum, rumors started swirling through the school. Whispers in the hallways, emails passed between parents, subtle jabs from teachers who clearly felt caught in the middle. Liam's mother was working overtime to spin the narrative. I heard she had been calling other families, insisting I was exaggerating, that I was using my son's scars to manipulate sympathy. She even tried to paint me as unstable, a mother who thrived on drama. I might have been shaken if I hadn't already prepared for this. Because what she didn't understand was that her attempts to smear me only pushed people closer to the truth. Parents who had been hesitant before were now reaching out quietly, texting me late at night with stories they hadn't dared share in public. My son quit soccer because Liam humiliated him in front of the whole team. My daughter started pretending to be sick just to avoid school. Each new message was another crack in the perfect facade she had built. But the real blow came one morning when I received a call from the district office. They wanted to schedule a meeting, not just with the principal, but with the superintendent and members of the school board. It was bigger now, and she knew it. That day, as I walked my son into the building, I saw her waiting by the gates, her face set in that tight, brittle expression. When our eyes met, she muttered low enough for only me to hear, "You're ruining my family." I stopped, turned, and answered softly but firmly, "You ruined mine first." For the first time, she had no comeback. The meeting with the district was different. These weren't people who could be swayed by charm or denial. They wanted facts. And I had them. I laid out everything, the binder thicker now, my son's voice recordings of taunts whispered in the hallways, even a video another parent had captured during recess showing Liam shoving him while others laughed. The silence in that conference room was telling. One board member actually sighed and said, "This is not just bullying. This is a culture problem." I knew then that real change was coming. Still, outside those walls, the pressure mounted. Liam avoided my son now, but he wasn't the same boy. He looked smaller somehow, no longer fueled by arrogance but by confusion. I overheard him once muttering to a friend, "My mom said I was supposed to be strong, but now she just cries all the time." It hit me then that in trying to shield her son from the pain of her brother's past, she had passed it on to him in a different form, burdening him with expectations he couldn't carry. The cycle was cracking, and even Liam was beginning to see through it. Then came the night that changed everything. My phone buzzed at 10 p.m., an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. When I answered, the voice on the other end was trembling. "This is Claire. Liam's mom." I almost hung up, expecting another attack, but her next words stopped me cold. "He told me he doesn't want to be me. He said he doesn't want to be cruel. And I don't know how to fix what I've done." Her voice broke then, years of armor collapsing in a single confession. For a moment I sat in stunned silence. Then I told her the only truth I had. You can't erase what happened. But you can stop feeding it. Start by teaching him the compassion you never gave my son. There was a long pause. And then she whispered, "I'm sorry." 2 words that didn't undo the pain, didn't erase the scars, but they marked the first time she had acknowledged the damage she'd caused. The following weeks felt different. The school introduced stricter protocols, teachers actively monitored interactions, and for once, accountability was more than a buzzword. My son started raising his hand in class again, walking through the halls without shrinking. He even asked to join an after-school club, something he hadn't dared before. The scars on his face hadn't changed, but the way he carried them had. He looked lighter, stronger, as though he was finally learning that his worth wasn't defined by anyone else's cruelty. And as for her, I still saw her at drop-off. Her face no longer sharp with defiance, but weighed down by something heavier. She didn't try to speak to me again, but she didn't need to. I had already seen the truth. She wasn't untouchable anymore. Her son had started questioning her. The community no longer shielded her, and the legacy of silence she had built was gone. But even as the dust began to settle, I knew this was not the final chapter. Because scars don't vanish overnight, not on the skin, not in the heart, and not in the minds of those who once used them as weapons. And I was ready, if needed, to keep fighting. Because my son deserved more than survival. He deserved to thrive. And I was going to make sure nothing, not even the ghosts of someone else's past, would ever take that away again. It was spring when the real test came. The district had launched new initiatives, posters hung in hallways with words like respect and kindness. Teachers had been retrained, and for a while it felt as though the tide had turned. But scars, I learned, don't only sit on the skin. They linger in memory. One afternoon, my son came home quieter than usual. He admitted Liam had tried again, not with fists or shoves this time, but with words whispered sharp enough to sting. "You think everyone pities you now? That's why you're untouchable." My son's voice cracked as he repeated it to me, not because he believed it, but because it was clear Liam was still grappling with his own place in this new balance. I sat with him, my hands folded over his, and reminded him, it's not pity that protects you. It's truth, and truth always outlasts lies. He nodded, his eyes tired but steady. The following week, a school assembly was held, showcasing students' artwork and writing on resilience. My son, for the first time, volunteered to read his piece aloud. I held my breath as he walked to the podium, his hoodie left behind in his chair, the light fully catching his scars. His voice didn't tremble. He spoke about bravery, about walking into rooms where people stared and learning to hold his head higher instead of lower. He spoke about scars not as wounds but as proof of survival. The gymnasium was silent, every child and parent watching, listening. Even Liam, sitting off to the side, couldn't look away. Afterward, as applause filled the room, I caught sight of Liam's mother. She wasn't clapping. She was staring at my son with wet eyes, her face pale and hollow. In that moment, I realized the weight of what she was seeing. Her brother's ghost in my child, not broken, not destroyed, but strong. Everything she had once believed was impossible. And for her, that truth must have burned. That evening, I found an envelope tucked under my windshield wiper. No name, but the handwriting was hers. Inside was a short letter, the words cramped and shaky. "I don't expect forgiveness. I only want you to know I see him now. I see his strength, and I see my failure. Please protect him in the way I could not protect my brother." I sat in the car for a long time, the paper trembling in my hands. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't repair. But it was a crack in her wall of denial. And maybe that was enough. My son never saw the letter. I decided not to show him, not yet. His journey was about building, not about carrying the weight of her guilt. Instead, I focused on giving him the space to grow. We signed him up for art classes, something he'd always wanted but never dared. He began drawing faces, often imperfect, lined with scars but always dignified, always radiant. I watched him pour into paper what he couldn't yet say aloud, that pain didn't erase beauty, it reshaped it. Meanwhile, Liam grew quieter. His circle of followers thinned, his dominance no longer intact. I noticed him lingering near my son's drawings one afternoon during a school showcase, his face troubled. He didn't approach, but he didn't sneer either. For the first time, there was hesitation in his eyes, maybe even envy. Not of the scars, but of the strength it took to carry them. And his mother? She no longer stood tall at the gates. She lingered in the background, her eyes often on me but her voice gone. The woman who once projected control now looked like someone trying to hold together pieces of a life built on fear. And every time she looked at my son, she paled again. Not just because of what she saw in him, but because of what she had failed to see in her own brother when she still had the chance. I didn't need her downfall to feel victorious. What mattered was that my son was rising, piece by piece, step by step, until the scars on his face were no longer marks of shame, but the foundation of a resilience that would carry him forward. And as I watched him laugh one evening, his smile free and unburdened for the first time in years, I knew the story wasn't about what had been done to him. It was about who he was becoming despite it. But deep down, I also knew there was still one more chapter waiting, a moment that would decide not just his healing, but whether she would finally face the truth she had been running from all along. And when that moment came, I promised myself we would be ready. That final confrontation began in a way I could never have predicted. It was the end of the school year, the air hot and thick with the smell of cut grass, children buzzing with the freedom of summer. The school was hosting a closing ceremony, awards for attendance, certificates for reading goals, the kind of event where parents lined the bleachers with phones held high. My son was nervous, but he wanted to go. He had been nominated for a small award in art, recognition for the sketches he had poured himself into all semester. I sat in the front row, my heart swelling with pride as his name was called, and he walked up without his hoodie for the first time in a public setting. The applause was warm, genuine, and I could see in his posture how much it meant. But just as he turned to walk back, I noticed Liam sitting stiffly 2 rows back, his mother's hand gripping his shoulder so tightly her knuckles were white. After the ceremony, families spilled into the courtyard. Kids ran through the grass, parents gathered in clusters. That's when it happened. Liam approached my son, his face pale but determined. He muttered something I couldn't hear, and my son froze. I was halfway to standing when Liam's mother appeared, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement. She barked his name, her voice tight, but before she could drag him away, he spoke louder, clear enough for the crowd to hear. "I'm sorry." Silence rippled around us. My son blinked, unsure how to respond. Liam's mother went rigid, her lips parting as though she couldn't believe the words had left his mouth. "I don't want to be like that anymore," he added, his voice breaking. "I don't want to hurt people because they're different." The courtyard was hushed. Dozens of eyes turned, parents whispering, teachers shifting awkwardly. And then Liam's mother snapped. She grabbed his arm and hissed, "Don't embarrass me." But Liam pulled away, his voice louder now, his face twisted with a mix of defiance and shame. "I'm not embarrassing you. You embarrassed yourself. Everyone knows what you said about Uncle. Everyone knows why you made me act like this." Her face went ashen, her hands trembling. The crowd erupted in murmurs, phones quietly raised, recording. The secret she had tried to bury had burst into daylight, and there was no retreat. She tried to speak, to salvage control, but her voice cracked. "That's enough, Liam." Yet the damage was done. Parents who had once smiled politely now stared coldly, their judgment heavy. Teachers avoided her eyes, and I simply stood there holding my son's hand, steady and silent, letting her collapse under the weight of her own choices. She stumbled away, dragging Liam behind her. But his eyes lingered on my son, not with cruelty, not with mockery, but with something closer to envy and maybe even respect. That night, social media lit up with whispers of the scene. Videos spread through parent groups, texts buzzed between families. The district could no longer pretend this was small. They launched an official review, not just of bullying incidents, but of the culture the school had allowed to fester. Liam's mother became the subject of every hushed conversation, her once perfect image shredded in a matter of hours. For someone who had lived her life maintaining control, losing it publicly was the ultimate wound. My son, though, carried himself differently after that day. He wasn't naive. He knew cruelty didn't vanish overnight. But he had seen something powerful, the bully who once tormented him unraveling in front of everyone, forced to face his own shame. And more importantly, my son had stood there with dignity, without lowering his head, without hiding his scars. For me, the victory wasn't in her humiliation, though it was sharp and undeniable. It was in watching my son's back straighten, his eyes brighten, his voice carry without fear. That was the revenge I hadn't even realized I wanted. Not punishment, not even apology, but the simple proof that no matter what she had tried to pass down, it hadn't broken him. Still, I knew there was one final piece to this story. One last confrontation that wasn't about schools or crowds or whispered rumors. It was about me and her, face to face, with no one else to hide behind. Because until that happened, the past she had tried to bury would keep festering. And I was ready to end it once and for all. The final confrontation came not at school, not in a meeting, but in the most ordinary of places, the grocery store on a quiet Saturday morning. I was standing in the produce aisle, my cart half full, when I turned and saw her. No armor this time, no polished outfit, no practiced smile. She looked smaller somehow, weighed down, her hair pulled back loosely, her face tired in a way I had never seen. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence between us. Then she walked over slowly, as if each step cost her something. Her voice, when it came, was thin. I can't undo what I did. To you, to him, to my own son. But I have to say it again. I'm sorry. I studied her, waiting for the familiar flicker of manipulation, the sharpness that always lurked behind her words. But it wasn't there. She wasn't fighting anymore. She was unraveling, and for the first time she seemed willing to sit in that ruin. I told her plainly, an apology doesn't erase scars. Not his, not yours. But maybe it's the start of something better if you mean it. Her eyes glistened and she whispered, I do. I see him every time I look at your son. I see the boy I couldn't save. There was nothing left to argue. No point in hatred anymore. I realized then that revenge hadn't come in the form of tearing her down. It had come in forcing her to face the truth, to stand in the open with no mask, and to know that her cruelty had failed. My son was still here, still strong, still smiling, and she couldn't take that from him. We parted without more words, and as I drove home, I looked at my son through the rearview mirror. He was humming softly to himself, a sketchbook balanced on his knees, drawing with that quiet concentration I adored. His scars caught the sunlight streaming through the window, and instead of sadness, I felt pride. They were part of him, yes, but they no longer defined him. What defined him was resilience, kindness, the strength to walk through fire and still keep his heart intact. That night, as I tucked him in, he whispered, Mom, I don't think about the bullying as much anymore. I think about the future. I kissed his forehead and told him, That's exactly where your eyes should be. And for the first time in years, I slept without the weight of fear pressing against my chest. Revenge hadn't been about destroying someone else. It had been about reclaiming my son's joy, his dignity, his right to take up space in the world without apology. And we had done that. Together. But now I wonder. If you were in my place, would you have confronted her in front of everyone? Exposed her shame the way I did? Or would you have chosen silence, hoping things would fix themselves? Tell me, what would you have done?